Welcome to In But Not Of, a podcast dedicated to applying a Christian worldview to the study of history and culture. We're so glad that you could join us today.
We must be in heaven, man. We must be in heaven, man.
So I could play that loop over and over again. You've heard it before. One of the most famous sayings from Woodstock, one of the most famous quotes. Of course, many of them had actually thought they were in heaven, right? And kind of had reached the pinnacle of what they stood for. So today in episode 7, 3 days that defined a nation, Woodstock, myth and reality, we're continuing our discussion of A Tale of Two Cities with Woodstock and Altamont, comparing the concerts. So that voice that you heard was Wavy Gravy of the Hog Farm, who was running the police force, not to be confused with the police force. They were hired for security. And he had the microphone quite a bit during the concert, and certainly is one of our lasting memories of what went on there. So just to recap last time, if you remember, so many concert goers showed up early that the organizers of the concert had to figure out whether or not to charge money or to build the stage. And clearly they chose to build the stage. They didn't have the resources, the time, the fencing, all sorts of things lined up to really collect tickets or charge admission. So that was one of the things that they had to decide early on. The other thing this did was so many people coming to the show, much more so than they had planned. This is going to make it difficult for bands to get to the stage. Remember, they have to get to this remote site too. And so just like much of the 1960s, Woodstock is going to have helicopters flying over the concert. And actually many of the famous images we have are from those helicopters. But some of the legacies that have come down to us, the myths, I guess you would, that's kind of been perpetuated by the media and by things that we've heard, are legion as far as Woodstock goes. So I'm just going to play a quick clip here, and this is one of them, actually.
New York State Thruway is closed, man.
Okay, that is Arlo Guthrie, a very young Arlo Guthrie. I believe he was something like 21 years old at the concert, but he looked 16. If you ever go back and look at the footage of it, of course, now he has long, flowing white hair. Then he had curly hair and looked very young. He looked very similar, in my opinion, to the organizer, Michael Lang, actually, as far as what they looked like with that curly, kind of grown out hair. But he made the statement that they just closed the New York Freeway. That actually didn't happen. There were massive traffic jams, as you can imagine, but the New York State Freeway was not closed. And so there is a bit of exaggeration that we've kind of had to deal with the Woodstock concert. And so I think that, again, this is going to be one of the things that's worth looking at. What actually is in our memory, and then what actually was true, what actually happened. One of the things, let's go back to ticket prices for a second. So it was a free concert. That is true. Free for some, that is, because remember, many had bought the tickets already for the show. And so if we were to use our standards today, those tickets would have cost somewhere between $130 and $170. So this wasn't free. They had paid already, were on their way to the show. And many of those ticket holders, when they got there, realized nobody was taking those tickets. And many of the people that had the best seats actually didn't pay a dime. Because they were there early and didn't pay for the show. They also, once people got there, realized that there were nowhere near enough toilets to meet the need of the number of people that actually showed up. Again, if you remember, they had planned for about 28,000 a day, maybe at the high end between one and absolute high end 200,000 people, according to Michael Lang. But they're going to have at least twice that, if not more than that actually show up. And so the other thing they tried to do, because remember, this was supposed to be a music fair of sorts, they made an attempt to still have that happen. So if you look at some old footage, you'll see some tie-dye booths where shirts were being sold. And then certainly in the festive kind of fair atmosphere, you had, samples of marijuana and paraphernalia, small little head shops kind of set up as well. And then also we've got this food issue that happens with so many people showing up. And another famous thing that happens here is this quote.
Good morning. What we have in mind is breakfast in bed for 400,000.
Breakfast in bed for 400,000. Now, how do you do that? Well, looking at the concessions for a second, basically they didn't have any. They didn't have any organized catering that was going to go on to meet the needs of the people that showed up because of the last minute change of site and things like that. So they had a group called Food for Love who agreed to do it. They had no catering experience, and they ran the concessions, but the problem was they ran out of food pretty quickly. So Wavy Gravy makes the announcement there. And that, breakfast in bed for 400,000 was a small little canister of homemade granola that they kind of threw together. Thanks to the kindness of the local people and businesses, they were able to at least feed the people something. Now, one of the things to think about is because there was such marijuana use going on at the show, one of the consequences of that, of course, is hunger, the munchies, if you will. So you had a lot of people that were hungry, and I don't think a little cup of granola did much for them, but it was something. Okay. And one of my favorite moments of the concert comes with John Sebastian. We'll talk more about him in a little bit, but he was not even supposed to play at the concert, but he gives us another lasting legacy of the concert.
Chip said that his old lady just had a baby, and that made me think, wow, it really is a city here. But this is for you and your old lady, man, and that kid's gonna be far out.
That kid's gonna be far out. Yes, he certainly would be. Now, here's the thing with there's been rumors for years of this kid being born at Woodstock, or babies in general being born at Woodstock. To my knowledge, in my research to this day, nobody has ever found that Woodstock baby or babies. There's been rumors. People have said they witnessed a birth, but to this day, there is no documented Woodstock baby. It just doesn't show up in the birth records of the town. The baby is not, no. Trust me, if there was, if we did know the identity of a Woodstock baby, they would certainly have their fair share of interviews being conducted over the years, and that has not happened. So technically, that's one of the myths of the concert. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that there weren't any, things that happen in terms of childbirth at hospitals, perhaps outside of Woodstock? And I mean, that's a more difficult thing to ascertain. Did people leave and, didn't feel well and had a baby? But that famous scene, I think what that conjures up in our minds is somebody going into labor right during the concert. And that does not seem to have happened. One of the interesting things, though, is when you look at the medical log. So there is a medical log from Woodstock, and there are some really interesting things that you see on this medical log. For instance, one of the things that you see is there's listed on there something that says there were 20 abortions threatened and complete. Not entirely sure what that is, but there was a fair number of miscarriages as well. And some of the things also, when you look at the medical log and what was actually treated on site on those 3 days of the concert, or more actually, there was 163 cases of anxiety, 39 cases of pink eye, 9 cases of gonorrhea, 135 puncture wounds in the foot due to people walking barefoot, and that doesn't count the 92 foreign bodies that were treated or removed from a foot. So you're looking at close to 1,500, foot issues. There were 6 cases of psychosis due to drug overdose. There was 1 raccoon bite and 11 rat bites, something else you might not think of. But this is important. This is why, by the way, it's important to look at primary sources. Draw your own conclusions. Don't let somebody frame history for you. Now, the other thing that happens with the medical supplies is by Saturday afternoon, they are out of medical supplies. I'm just going to play this brief clip here so you can hear basically how this was alleviated.
The United States Army has led us some medical teams. There are 45 doctors who are here without pay because they dig what this is into. They're with us, man. They are not against us. They are with us. They're here to give us all a hand and help us.
So I don't know if you could hear that, but the United States Army showed up with medical supplies. And the announcer says they're with us, man. They're here without pay. They've brought these doctors, and which is a real neat moment, I think, in the concert. I say concert. Remember, it's 3 days, okay? But it's not really appropriate to call them concerts because it was a unified event, and so that's why I keep using that term. And then one of the more infamous moments of the concert, okay, could be heard with this famous quote.
To get back to the warning that I've received, you may take it with however many grains of salt you wish, that the brown acid that is circulating around us is not specifically too good. It's suggested that you do stay away from that. Of course, it's your own trip, so be my guest, but please be advised that there is a warning on that one, okay?
Stay away from the brown acid. It's funny because there's other announcements throughout the concert that talks about some bad green and blue acid as well. But that's one of the lasting legacies of the show too. This idea of the brown acid, there was bad acid going around. Also, some of the other infamous things that kind of happened that aren't as celebrated, that aren't as magnified when we look back at Woodstock, is the one individual, the one young man who died at the concert. He was run over in his sleeping bag by a truck coming to clean the portable toilets. Now, some of the witnesses that were there basically say that, he was sleeping in a field that was just littered with garbage. And so the truck driver, unfortunately, saw these, human garbage everywhere, and he was buried underneath the sleeping bag, and he really couldn't tell the difference between, what was garbage and what was alive, unfortunately. And so he died. And so that was a sad moment, and again, not one that's often, looked at. Also, we had another individual who died from, many argue it was a heroin overdose. Some say it was in the treating of a potential overdose with what they gave him that killed him. But there was that happened as well. And at least one incident where a girl broke her neck falling off one of the towers. But the other thing, too, that I think is lost sometimes is the singers who didn't show up. There were a lot of singers who were invited that either didn't come, didn't understand what was going to happen, which I guess nobody really did. But many musicians, like the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan, for instance, were playing a concert at the Isle of Wight, which took place a short time after Woodstock. And so they were on their way there. So many of the acts that you see that don't show up at Woodstock play there. And so that's quite a unique concert, and deserves some analysis of its own because it happens outside of the United States of America. The other thing, perhaps you've heard the song Woodstock, which again makes the concert famous. The Crosby, Stills, Nash. I don't remember if it was Crosby, Stills, Nash or CSN&Y that actually records Woodstock. I think it might be CSN&Y, but Joni Mitchell actually wrote the song, and she was a very famous and respected songwriter from the period, who actually wasn't even invited to Woodstock, but she didn't care because she was going to appear on the Dick Cavett Show, which was a major talk show, entertainment show. And Dick Cavett became synonymous with the counterculture as well because of his interviews with them and his kind of friendly, kind of discussions he had with especially people like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. So she writes the song Woodstock, actually watching highlights or watching the concert itself from a hotel room. And she writes the lyrics to the concert, and yet she wasn't even there, to the song Woodstock, I should say. Well, if we look at the music lineup, let's do that. Day one, Friday, August 15th, singer Richie Havens is basically collared backstage at the concert, and he's not supposed to go on until 4th or 5th, and they talk him into opening the concert, which he was not ready to do. He is scared and nervous, and very famously, though, opens the show. And he is ushered back onto the stage several times because the other bands are not there yet. The people that are supposed to play do not show up. So Richie Havens is out there with his guitar and famously continues to sing. And he is making it up as he goes. One of the things he does is he plays a song called Freedom, and it basically makes it up on the spot. And that becomes one of the famous moments of Woodstock because everybody gets up and they're kind of really into it. And he kind of saves the day in a lot of ways because he kind of takes one for the team there and goes out there in a very stressful situation and plays. Unfortunately, sadly, Havens died a few years ago, and he actually had his ashes spread at Woodstock, where he became famous. Other bands, though, from day one, you had Sweetwater, Bert Summer, Tim Hardin, Ravi Shankar, Melanie, Arlo Guthrie, who we already heard from, and then Joan Baez does a famous set. She comes on. She doesn't get onto the stage till about 1 o'clock in the morning, and she's 6 months pregnant. Her husband is being held in jail. He's a protester for the peace movement, and so there's some very famous dialogue that happens on stage about that. So these days kind of merge into each other because the artists are playing basically all night. It's they're coming on after midnight, and so the dates are they're there for cosmetic reasons, I guess. But you had on Saturday you had Country Joe McDonald, John Sebastian, who we heard from with the baby. We have the Keith Hartley Band. We have Santana, one of the most famous and really the best act that we see play in terms of music quality. Santana, who's the lead guitar player, Carlos Santana, who's very famous to this day, highly respected guitar player, was tripping so badly on LSD when he performed that he thought his guitar neck was a serpent. So you can actually, if you watch the video footage, you can actually see him struggling to get through his set, but musically very sound, very good. The incredible string band Canned Heat, the Grateful Dead go on very late. They actually play, I think it's their last song is 50 minutes long. But they have a set, that they finally do, which pushes Leslie Weston Mountain play, but then Creedence Clearwater Revival, who was the first band assigned to play at Woodstock, doesn't come on until 3 o'clock in the morning. John Fogerty to this day jokes that there was one person with a lighter out in the crowd that he knew was paying attention to him, so he played the entire concert for that one individual. But he was not happy with their performance, the quality, the time, and so he does not allow their performance to be part of the Woodstock movie originally anyways. Janis plays, and then Sly and the Family Stone give a high energetic performance. And then The Who show up and play. And varying feedback, I mean, some people say it was one of the best performances they'd ever seen. Others say it wasn't that good. They basically go on at dawn, and Abby Hoffman comes up on stage, and Pete Townsend actually hits him. So when you see that it was 3 days apiece, there was an incident where Pete Townsend hits Abby Hoffman to get him off the stage, and that kind of goes. It's not a big deal, but it is kind of a funny thing that history kind of forgets about. And then Jefferson Airplane does a famous version of Volunteers. Morning Maniac music, as Grace Slick calls it. On Sunday, the Beatles make an appearance, not literally, but through Joe Cocker. Little help from my friends. He makes that famous. Country Joe and the Fish, famous for the Fixin' to Die rag about Vietnam. 10 years after, Johnny Winter, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Sometimes Young show up, and it was Sometimes Young even here because he comes on stage at some point, and there's discrepancy in terms of when that was, but they do have some video footage of him there. And then it was only their second time playing together, although some sources say the first time, but I believe it was their second time playing together. And actually in the movie, their music is not live at the concert; it was dubbed in later. So what you're hearing is not actually what they sounded like that night. And then finally, we get to Monday. And this is where you have the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. Sha Na Na, in my opinion, the most bizarre moment of the concert, what they're doing there, I have no idea. But they show up and they're playing their old 50s songs and being cartoonish, which they were expected to do. I was a big Sha Na Na fan growing up, actually. And then Jimi Hendrix does his famous set where the Star Spangled Banner, the famous Star Spangled Banner he does on his guitar, and what a great sounding version of it. Actually, it was very controversial at the time. Was it disrespectful? What was it? But you can literally hear, and this was said, and I don't think it's an exaggeration. With his guitar, you can hear what sounds like bombs and all sorts of things going off, and it's really reflective of the 1960s. One of the weird things was here Hendrix gives this epic moment at the end of the concert. By the way, most people had left. There was only about 30,000 people left there when he actually did that version. But they had originally planned on having Roy Rogers and Dale Evans end the concert with Happy Trails. Imagine how much different that would have been. So there's some part of me, though, that thinks it would have worked anyways. So there's much more analysis and much more to say, and I will do that when we tie the two concerts together. But I want to just explore briefly how Woodstock could have been different if we remembered it today for the things that almost happened or could have happened. For instance, what if the local people in the helicopters weren't there to bail out the poor planning in terms of concessions, the delivery of medical supplies? Would we still have had 3 days of love and peace? How about the rain? Do you know when the rain came and you hear everybody yelling, "No rain, no rain"? There were 50,000 volts of cables that had been left uncovered. And it's been, considered that many people could have been electrocuted in a horrifying manner, because of that. Imagine what Woodstock would have been remembered as if that had happened. How would it be remembered if many were electrocuted in that moment? How about this? What if it just kept raining? How would this have been different? Many did leave the concert when the rains came, actually. And what if we didn't have those memories after the rain left, after the skies cleared? No Hendrix, no, a lot of other things that didn't happen. Would this have gone down as a complete disaster? How about this? What if Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, had done what he threatened to do many times during those 3 days, calling in the National Guard, calling in the military, not to deliver food or medical supplies, but to clear the place out? Imagine how different that would have been. And I think I bring this up because it shows something that we often take for granted, and that is the common grace of God. We take for granted the common grace that God sheds on all of us, even on those of us who reject him and live contrary to his will and his instructions. Psalm 145:9 says, "The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all that he has made." In Matthew 5:45, it reminds us that God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. So you see, this reminds us that good things happen to bad people, and bad things happen to people who are at least trying to live the right way. Acts 14:17 reminds us where it says, "He did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." That reminds us, I think, that the Woodstock generation was right, in the sense that they were the first generation who really started to care for God's creation in a unified manner. They brought everyone's attention to the harm that we were doing to the environment. But often you see they did so while denying the creator who designed the beauty of nature, and they ended up replacing him with an Eastern worldview that either denied him altogether or lowered him to the status of being intertwined and synonymous with the creation. Sometimes when you're spared great tragedy or snapped from the jaws of death, it can change you. And when I think of the common grace of God, that was just, again, another example here in these 3 days that you see. It reminds me of Romans 2:4, where it says, "Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance?" What could have happened? those scary moments when you realize what you were spared from. Roger McGuinn of the Byrds was very much at the centerpiece of the 1960s. Early on, maybe 65, 66, Crosby was in the band, the Byrds, from Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Roger McGuinn became a Christian. And certainly the kindness and forbearance and patience that he witnessed during these years led him in the 1970s to embrace Christ. I have seen him a few times, and I will tell you, it's a real neat experience to go see Roger McGuinn sing some old-time gospel tunes while older hippies are sitting there clapping and singing along, and I'm not sure they totally grasp the difference in worldview that they have with Roger. But that common grace, some of this kindness that was shown by the older generation in the town of Bethel and in the authority figures who intervened to help. There was an interview done with some of the townspeople, and it very much reminded me of the biblical concept of the alien and the sojourner. Some of the townspeople looked at it as a mission, reflective of treating the kids that invaded their town with mercy and Christian charity. You could actually hear him say this in the interviews, that they were there wasn't anything they could do about it, and they were going to do their best to help these kids. You almost get emotional when you hear that, and you see the 1960s was such a sad time in so many ways, and it really there was goodness on both sides of our cultural divide, and it's something I'm going to spend more time talking about. But it really is sad in some ways. But all this points to the fact that it's often forgotten that God is the great sustainer. We talk about him as creator. We forget that he is also the great sustainer. And the Woodstock Concert, those 3 days really show and remind us of the way that he sustains us. Colossians 1:16-17 says, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." God sustains his created order even when we have done our best to destroy it through greediness and pollution, or when we deny his created order and his sovereignty over us by designing our own moral order, believing we can, quote, get back to the garden, unquote. Well, that's all we have time for today. But remember, all truth is God's truth. And if Jesus is who he says he is, then that changes everything. We hope you enjoyed being with us today. Join us each week for In But Not Of, a podcast dedicated to applying a Christian worldview to the study of history and culture.